to record it, I think.
Okay, I'm recording now, accidentally. All right. Cool. All right, well, I guess I'll go first. So I found it interesting that in the article, we kind of got a very different perspective than we did from the Mad Men episode. Even though, like, Mad Men, like, that's a 50-minute episode, they can't just put everything in and have it be, like, all historically accurate. But I found it interesting that in the Mad Men one, it was more concerned about, like, let's make it more, like, American and less woman focused. And in the engineering consent, it was like, all right, like, let's target that female market, focus on, like, eliminating the health concerns while also competing with other people. And I think it's interesting to look back to, like, going off of the lecture and say, like, history as we know it now, like, obviously we know a lot more things now than they did back then about like health concerns that are prevalent now, where like cancer and all that stuff. And yes, like, it was evolving as cigarettes were like becoming more popular, and as people were researching more into it. But I just find it interesting to look at like the history then and now. So
I kind of just talked about how in the show, like, it's the same brand, it's Lucky Strike, and I kind of just mentioned how, like, I don't know how to word it. Basically, they kind of, like, in the show, they were also kind of focused on, like, the health issues, and then in real life they were also like, how do we still manage to sell this product as something that's good, despite all of, like, these articles and the scientific research saying that it's bad. And I think that in the show, because they were also focusing on how, like, to just sell it in general, they kind of forgot how, like, to make it seem good. But in real life, I also read that in the article they developed, like, a bureau that would kind of just say, like, internal revenue statistics on tobacco, like, this is good, it makes the bacteria in your mouth go, like, away, blah 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 blah. And then I kind of just, like, tied it into how it's kind of against the Marxist viewpoint that was in the PowerPoint, because it just feeds into the capitalist, like, view of, like, a corporation and stuff like that. And, like, advertising is very big with the corporations and capitalism and making money and stuff like that. So Mad Men, they're just trying to sell things, and they kind of go with it with a cultural approach too, in the article, because they're, like, trying to sell it as something that's fashionable and something that can make a woman seem, like, desirable and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I also agree that, like, the Mad Men episode focused more on just, like, how to sell it in general. It was more focused on, like, the science of advertising, kind of. We kind of see, like, how psychology started to play a role in that, and, like, how they were starting to tap into that. Whereas the article talks more about how, like, they started to advertise toward women. And I agree that it follows. I was, like, going through seeing which like, interpretation it fits more into, and I think it's more like cultural history, maybe also social history, because it says, like, it examines the ideologies of pop culture during a historical movement. So, like, it was more of a shift when, like, something that had been typically known to be advertised to just men was also starting to be advertised towards women as well.
Mm-hmm. And that can kind of, like, relate to the second question, which is to discuss how the screening relates to the notes we went over in the lecture covering this. I kind of just talked about how the role of women in the show, and basically how, despite, like, all of, like, the sexist, like, undertones that the show has and stuff like that, they kind of still try to hint at, like, equality, which is, like, a very false sense of equality too, because when Peggy is first introduced into the office, Joan is, like, giving her a tour of, like, all of the technology and stuff like that, and she's like, oh, they made this technology, like, easy for even a woman can use it or whatever. And they kind of just, like, really emphasize smoking in the show and kind of, like, try to equate everything to, like, glamour and beauty and, like, equality. And, like, in the article as well, they mentioned how they're trying to sell it to women despite it being a product that was originally sold to men, which is kind of just like, again, feeding into the cultural standards of like gender roles and how women are perceived like in the media.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with you, like the cultural part. And I'll talk about this later, but I found an article and it's basically like the double standard of like, okay, we want to target the female market,
Mm-hmm.
and that like males, like when they're smoking a cigarette, it's more along the lines of like, oh, they're so masculine and they have this power about them. Whereas when a woman smokes it, it's like, oh, she's elegant and she's showing off like her female, like her femininity, however you say it. There's like her feminine characteristics.
Yeah.
So I kind of felt like it was very double standard-ish, but I definitely think the cultural approach like really targets it because of those gender roles. Like we kind of see the evolution of the gender roles throughout the article better than in Mad Men. Yeah.
And in the article, it even says, I wrote this one down, it says that, like, Lucky Strikes wasn't single-handedly responsible for, like, this cultural change. Like, it wasn't just, like, they started advertising and women started smoking, but it was, they more so, like, exploited the cultural change at the time. So, like, they saw that, like, there was this shift of, like, women going into society, because I think it was, like, 1920s. So, like, start, like, entering society more, like, the liberated female, things like that, and they saw that and they took advantage of that and they started advertising it like, oh, look at, like, if you smoke this, like, you're a symbol that, like, you're liberated, you're like, I don't know, you're free.
Yeah. And you know what's funny? Okay, so this is like completely off topic, but like while they were talking about like the women smoking and stuff like that, I kind of remembered Titanic and how there was a scene where Rose like starts smoking a cigarette and her mom looks at her and she's just like, what are you doing? Like, you're a lady, blah, 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 blah. And it's like the movie takes place in like 1912. So it's just like, it kind of made me think about how like there was a complete shift between like 1912 and like the 1920s once like women started becoming part of the ads for smoking. And then eventually how like the ads started to try to sell the cigarettes to women. But yeah.
I find it interesting too that in the article, and I can't remember like what the specifics of it were, but basically like, okay, women smoking inside for the most part like is fine, like in the comfort of your home. Yeah. And like it really was evolving, but still if you were to smoke outside, it was kind of like, oh, like maybe that's not as cool, kind of like leave that to the men, which I thought like was odd because obviously like these changes are so gradual, but just kind of like why are we differentiating between inside and outside? So
Yeah, and even in the show, you can kind of see that for, like, men, smoking is a very social, like, it was just like a social event almost. Like, they would smoke in the office, smoke, like, in the elevator, smoke basically anywhere where there was also other people around. And it talks about that shift in the article where women, like, smoked inside, and then for them, it also started to become more of a social activity as well.
Yeah.
Almost like drinking, of like, that was like, prior to that, like prior to cigarettes, like drinking alcohol was like your social activity, or like even now, I mean, like alcohol is like a social activity.
Yeah. I also kind of wanted to talk about how, like with the gender roles and stuff like that, when Peggy goes into, I think his name is Draper, Mr. Draper.
Yeah.
When he goes into like his office, like kind of like near the end of the episode, and she's just like, because like they kept getting it into her head that she was basically kind of just like there for the men, for their entertainment. And then she kind of goes there and tries to like touch his hand or whatever, and then he like just says like, I don't know what you're doing, but like don't touch me, like if you do this again, you'll never work a day in your life like anywhere. So I just feel like, I don't know, it just kind of like builds onto like the social structures of what society was for a woman in the 60s, and especially how like in the workplace they weren't really there to work, they were just there for the men basically.
What also surprised me is like that scene where like she's getting prescribed the pill, and like the way that the doctor is like talking to her, he's like, don't like feel like you have to take it, get your use out of this or whatever. Just the kind of comments that they were allowed to make.
Yeah. And he's
also I was just gonna say like oh my goodness, I forget her name. But the lady, I liked her dress. Or like her, whatever she was wearing, her uniform, whatever you want to call it.
Jo- I think her name is Joanne.
Yes, Joan, something like
Mhm.
that, or like, yeah, Joanna, a J name, I think. So basically, it sounded like she had referred Peggy to like the OBGYN, and I was like,
Yeah.
what? Like, I understood it, but I was just, while I was watching the episode, I was like, no, she didn't. I was like, what? Why? Um, just
I,
because.
Yeah,
I
that's
thought
what because
it
that's
was
what the
more
doctor said. He was like, you sent like your friend Joan sent you over.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I
He
know what
also
kind of woman she is.
other
Yeah,
like there too.
yeah.
I don't know. I kind of thought into like some weird American Horror Story type of thing where he like just like rips her apart or something like at there. I got so scared. I was like, oh
Yeah,
no.
I was nervous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And oh, I just want birth control. And I was like, oh, okay. But yeah. Um, should we move on to the third question? Okay.
Sure.
Okay.
The third question is each group member should find one outside article or scholarly source. Must be either a book chapter, and then just kind of discuss how this outside source relates to the screening.
Okay. So the one that I chose we did this in another class, but it was Laura Mulvey and the male gaze.
Mm-hmm.
So the male gaze, obviously, women are reduced to like just being admired for their physical appearance. Like you're put in the perspective of like a male viewing a female. Like it'll zoom in on like curves or something, or like just accentuate parts to let you know that like she's just there to be looked at. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that like that also kind of applies to advertising and also just in general how women were viewed throughout the episode. Like there's making comments, they're just like, oh, but you have like nice legs, it'd be nice if I could actually see them. And
Mm-hmm.
even it also talks about in the article how like a woman being forced to view herself through a male gaze also will internalize that. So I think you can also see that in episode with Joan and how she like tells Peggy, she's like, you have to do this, this, and this to like, because this is how it is in the office, like this is what you're here for. And how it applies to the article is that, you know, like women see this image of themselves. They were advertising what, like a um slim American women. They're like, this is the ideal type, this is the thing you want to be. And women probably like internalize that and we're like, oh yeah, I should buy this so that I can be that and become that image that I'm seeing advertised.
Yeah, I think that's like a very interesting article to bring in, or like, what is it? It's a book or an article?
It's an article.
An article. Okay. So I think like that can like apply to a lot of things that we see
Mm-hmm.
nowadays. Or even just like things that we examine from the past. I will go ahead and pull up my article. Um, so mine was titled Gender Smoking and Tobacco Reduction and Cessation, a Scoping Review. I hope I pronounce cessation, if that's the proper word, right? Um, so basically, kind of what I said before, but it mentions how men, when they smoke a cigarette, it's like it's power, it's aggressive, like they're commanding the room. But when a woman smokes it, it's like she's showing that she's feminine, and she's showing her beauty and like whatever, like the ideal figure, the modern figure. Um, and I just thought it was really ironic because for a male and a female, smoking means completely different things. Like I don't most men, I don't think who smoke a cigarette are like, "Oh my goodness, let me hop on this trend so I can lose weight or so that I can appear more feminine." Find if that's for you. Um but I just thought it was very interesting, kind of like this double standard that we were seeing. Um and also kind of, I don't know how I want to phrase this. I guess just kind of like the different ways that an advertisement can be twisted. Like you can look at an advertisement so many different ways just based on like your experiences. Even looking through like the cultural approach, like that lens, just like regardless of like your gender roles or anything like that. So.
And that's interesting because in the article it also talks about how like this is the different ways you can view smoking, or like expressions can be there's many emotions that can be expressed by either smoking or not smoking. Like if he
Right.
takes a pause, he's like surprised. If he's like smoking rapidly, he's like anxious. But like that's if a man is smoking. What would it mean if a woman was smoking?
The women are, let's see, like they posed. Your articles kind of relate to mine. I kind of just, so my article was actually like about the show and talks about the show, but it talks about like the gender and power like roles that like the men have versus the women. So like I don't even know the title anymore because I didn't write it down on here. I only put the link because it was going to be easier if I had my computer. Anyway, one of the quotes that I wrote down was, an influential advertising agency being so closely linked with the success of capitalism shaping the desires of the population becomes a representative space for the changes capitalism wreaks on the culture, displaying the different gender expectations, new paths to being powerful, and the corresponding limitations. So it kind of just talks about how the power that like the men have in the office versus the women, despite like Joan being a woman who's like a businesswoman, she's like on top basically of like her department and stuff like that. She's still one of the women, like next to a man, she still basically does not have the same power that Draper would have against anybody. Like she probably wouldn't be able to have the same power to like fire Peggy if she did anything wrong, but Draper would, despite her being at the top of her department. And then I kind of also just talked about how they're very focused on trying to come up with the advertising campaign for the cigarettes and stuff like that, but because of like the capitalist, like the like view of capitalism and corporations even in the 60s, like they're still trying to figure out how they could like twist the words for the product so they could still sell it. And it just kind of discusses like capitalism and the economy growing and all of that being like under the power of a man, and despite like women being the prime people who like are targeted to buy these products, the men are still the ones in charge and coming up with everything and ruling them in a way. So yeah.
And you see that in the episode too, because I forget the lady that he has a meeting with, but like he has that meeting with her and he like brings up his ideas and he's like doesn't expect to be shot down. And then like she shoots down his idea because like she's like, that's not the vision that I have for my store. And he's like, well, I'm not going to be talked to by a woman like this.
Yeah. And I don't know, like that meeting really threw me off because at the same time, when they first meet, didn't they say, oh, we were expecting a man, and she said my father was too.
Yeah.
Yes. And like he went to shake the man's hand, like I think it's like an assistant of some sort, or maybe he did work
he was
for the
like
company.
An art director. Yeah.
Okay, I was thinking art for some reason. Yeah. And I was like, whoa.
And she was like, plot twist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I found it interesting that like I know, so like the secretaries, like I guess that's just what I'll call them, but like the other women who work in the department, they were not really treated with respect. Like they're just kind of objects, like lying around the office, if you will. But I would have expected that when like when this lady who's trying to make a deal and she's trying to expand her business and she comes in and she's like, look, like you have to give me some advertisement ideas, that he would be like, okay, let me give you the same respect, or at least disguise my like sexist views and just look at you as a client, like kind of like the customer's always right mentality that she kept bringing up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that something else that I mentioned here that also kind of tied in with what my article talked about, or just like what they were also the article that like we had to read, is that in all the scenes where like a woman is smoking a cigarette in the show, it kind of is like implied that she just has more like, I don't know how else to put it, like sex appeal, I guess, than just like the other women. Because like in the scene where she's showing Peggy around, she like pulls out a cigarette, and you see Peggy as like this like innocent like little she's like not from the city, I guess.
Or
Well,
Amish.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. While like Joan is like this like she's up there and she's also smoking. So
Yeah. Mm.
is there another question?
Yeah, there's one more. How, if at all, has the combination of the screening and the article you read changed your perspective on communication?
I mean, I think there are like so many different lenses
Yeah.
that we can look at, like whether it be like the article, like engineering consent, or like our personal articles, or even the Mad Men episode, or like any TV show that we watch, really, like any media that's out there, you can look at it through different lenses. Like Cindy, I know you brought up the, what was it, the Marxist approach at the very beginning, and like I hadn't even thought of that approach as being one that like we could look at it through, and I was like, oh, like that does make sense. I was so focused on like the gender roles and the cultural one. So I think kind of just like shifting our focus and being able to look at everything like through potentially different lens, like even through like looking back on history and being like, okay, like we know so much more now than they did, so we can't necessarily fault like cigarette companies for giving like people these awful products. So I don't know. I guess like just kind of my view has been expanded in a way, and like I'm someone who likes to look at things from multiple perspectives. But I think doing it, especially for communication, is really important and can be really valuable.
Yeah. Well, like, so the reason I kind of looked at it through like a Marxist approach is because I was thinking about more of like how it's an advertising agency and they're very focused on the corporation and the consumers. And I was like, this is very opposite of what Marxism is. um, so, and also because I'm a PR minor. So I'm kind of thinking about how like the whole goal of like advertising and PR is to sell a company and try to make it look good, despite most of them being like iffy, because most corporations do have like dirty work within them. So I don't know, it kind of just like, it didn't really change my views in a way, but it does just like kind of show in a broader light how a lot of companies will go out of their way to like purposefully try to make themselves look good, even if they're very aware that the thing that they're doing could be bad, like trying to sell cigarettes despite all of these articles saying like it's bad, but they're still trying to like find the good in the product. And yeah, and then also I kind of talked about how even like companies will try to go through like a cultural structure, like with gender roles and stuff like that, like with women's razors and deodorant and shampoo, like it's essentially the same product, but it's just like targeted more towards women. And yeah.
I think just with everything that I learned in this class is basically that like communication is more than just what we think it is, because there's always like there's like the surface level meaning, and then there's that meaning that's like implied, or like I think in the lecture it's like the historical facts, that like it's not just like, oh, he died this day, he was born this day, but it's like deeper, that you need to like analyze. And just something just as small as smoking, which I'd never thought about the history of smoking before, but like how just the image of somebody smoking in a film, all the different things that can imply. I think it's interesting to think about.
Yeah. Oh, like while I was reading that, and because you mentioned how like smoking can imply something about a character, I was also thinking about how like in the first lecture that we had when it was Cheers, and we were talking about how like eye color and like hair color for a character can like
Mm-hmm.
mean something about them and kind of like set them out for the rest of the series. Um, like smoking can do the same thing, especially like in this show where everybody's doing it, and it kind of just like gives them like a certain role based on how they smoke and whether they smoke or not. But yeah. That's the last question, guys.
And we did our. Do y'all want me to pause it or just stop it? I guess stop it.
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna stop mine too.
Okay.
I didn't